Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome you all to Fortifying Faith. Hope everyone is doing well, inshallah ta'ala. Tonight is episode number 4. And we are very blessed and honored to have a very special guest with us, who will be on with us right in a moment, inshallah ta'ala. If you all can go ahead and hit that share button. Get it out to your friends, family, all those that you know are interested in watching, inshallah ta'ala. As you all know, Fortifying Faith is our monthly series in place of the Mistle Seminar that we are not having this year. We've had a number of guests. We've had Ustad Fahad Taslim, Ustad Mubin Vaid, Imam Dawood Walid, and the theme lies around fortifying our faith, issues that we struggle with, issues that we often face that are contentious issues. And alhamdulillah, we've covered quite a bit. We started off with doubts. We spoke about doubts in general. And then we talked about the LGBTQ question, which is a hot question these days. And we had Imam Dawood Walid to talk about activism and the Islamic parameters and kind of how we view it as Muslims. Tonight we are very honored to have with us Sheikh Dr. Abdullah bin Hamid Ali, all the way from California, from Zaytuna College. Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh.
Sheikh.
How are you doing, Sheikh?
Alhamdulillah, I'm doing well. Alhamdulillah, I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Alhamdulillah, we're doing all right as well. Alhamdulillah. We are very blessed and honored to have you. And I don't think it's sunset yet on the West Coast.
No, we're about an hour from now.
Okay, all right, mashallah. Alhamdulillah. So today's topic, before I introduce the topic, I'd like to introduce Sheikh Abdullah bin Hamid Ali. Sheikh Abdullah bin Hamid Ali is someone who, those of you that follow online or on social media are familiar with the Zaytuna faculty. He's a core member, mashallah ta'ala. And just some quickly going over his biography, he has a BA or ijaza ulya from the in Islamic Law, in Shariah, from the Al-Qarawiyin University in Fes, Morocco, which is one of the most prestigious universities in the Muslim world. He also has a Ph.D. in cultural and historical studies from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. And he is an author and translator of multiple Islamic publications, including some of Imam al-Ghazali's works. And he is also a professor of Islamic law at the Zaytuna College. He's a faculty member. And he is also the founder and head of the Lamppost Education Initiative. There's a lot of great work that he does, a lot that he's involved with. And alhamdulillah, we are honored to learn from you, Sheikh.
Alhamdulillah. It's an honor to be here.
Alhamdulillah. So tonight's topic is slavery and Islam. And obviously, those of us who either at a college level or a high school level, in your history class, or just generally, if you're participating in the social debates and the conversations that are going around, at some point, you get into the question about slavery and the moral justifications for slavery, or is slavery inherently evil or immoral? And then obviously, at least me here as serving the community, at some point, someone will come up to you and in the Quran, it's, the verses that talk about, ma malakat yaminuk, and the verses are there, and the hadith are there. So it's not something that we can really push to the side. But instead, we hope to understand and talk about that issue. And Sheikh Abdullah, as we're beginning, I would like for you to first start off, if you can kind of help us understand what's the miftah for this discussion? What's the key to this discussion? How do we start and where do we go amid all the confusion and all the stuff that we read and come across?
Inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa afdal as-salati wa atammu at-taslim ala nabiyyina wa habibina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Alhamdulillah, this is an extremely important topic, a very sensitive one, as you've highlighted, and I do applaud you and your organization, Masjid, in your city for taking the opportunity to try to address some of the concerns of the young Muslims, because as we know, the youth are the future, and if we don't have committed believers in Islam, then we won't have any Islam. But the miftah, as you said, the starting point or the key to properly understanding and wrestling with this particular topic, which is very sensitive, as we know, for many different reasons, is to talk a bit about what is what we can call our moral grounding. What are our moral foundations? In other words, when we feel unease about something, are we feeling uneasy about that particular issue because of a visceral reaction that we simply have and is sort of motivated by just my subjective feelings and thinking about an issue? Or is it rooted in some type of philosophical foundation? Say, for instance, either secularism or say feminist thinking or queer theory, et cetera, or is it based upon what we call the usul, the foundations of Islam, the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And so we are believers, meaning that we believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we believe in the Messenger ﷺ, and we believe them to be truthful. We believe them to be wise in their decisions and in their legislation. And so fundamentally, we have to reconcile this with ourselves from the very beginning, because if we are utilizing a different moral compass, a different moral criteria to determine the morality or immorality of any given action, other than the Quran and the Sunnah and the other sources of Islam, then we are not actually thinking as Muslims are expected to think. Muslims are expected to think as the Creator has guided us to think. So fundamentally, that is really always the starting point. For example, if you are one who has embraced feminist thinking, feminist thought, then one of the pillars of feminist thought is that patriarchy is evil. And so that is to say that any society where men have the ultimate, the greatest privilege, they themselves, they hold all of the major offices of power, that men themselves are expected to be the protectors and the ultimate custodians of society, which includes women and children that live under them. Then when you read the Quran, and for instance, and you open up the Quran to verse 434, Surah 4, verse 34, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ar-rijalu qawwamuna 'ala an-nisa, then you will find yourself uneasy. And that particular verse translates to mean men are the caretakers of women. So if you already assume it to be a proof or a fact that patriarchy in any given form is universally evil, it should be evil, should have been known to be evil for all of human history, then you now have run into a speed bump, as we would say, perhaps not into a wall, perhaps a speed bump, because fundamentally we hope that we continue to move and to move over the speed bump and continue upon your path. But of course, if you don't continue upon your path, then it would be like running into a wall. So fundamentally, what you have to do now is question whether or not your thinking or the other person's philosophy's thinking about this issue is the correct and the most objective way to think about the issue, or is it the criteria given to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger salawatullah wa salamu alayhi. So that would be, I would say, the miftah to this topic or any given topic which is very troubling to the reader or the listener.
Jazakallah khairan, Sheikh. So just to summarize, the foundations for us as Muslims are different. Our foundations, our principles, we derive from the Quran and the Sunnah, and that's where we go back to. So, Sheikh, we only have about an hour or so, and that's why I didn't take too much time in the introduction. Really getting into the topic, when it comes to definitions and concepts, right? And, it's well known, in the Islamic books and our tradition, the first kind of discussions are about istilah, about definition. And if you can't correctly define something, you can't correctly place an accurate ruling or structure that discussion. So when we're talking about slavery and considering that slavery is as an institution in some capacity has been either practiced or defended by almost every civilization and almost every religion of some sort in the past, as far back as we can go, and we have recorded history, that starting with the prophets and our Prophet ﷺ, and then working its way through, and then even now till before the abolition movement. So with all of this, obviously not each slavery is the same. And so what do you feel is a universal definition for our discussion today? Or would you kind of group it into a few different categories depending on the time, place, etc.?
Right. I mean, slavery, I think the broadest definition we can give for slavery, which would be accepted by everyone, would be a person's ownership of another person, right? And of course, that ownership could be for the purpose of domestic service or for industry or for personal benefit in some way, shape, or form. And so I think that in itself spans most of human history. For most of our history, slaves have existed, at least most of written history. And of course, the assumption is that they've existed from the very beginning, especially if we think about the beginning being connected to the biblical ideas about Noah, alayhi salam, the prophet Noah and his sons, the curse of Ham, this particular theory, which fundamentally posited that that Ham, which happened to be believed to be one of the sons of Noah alayhi salam, was made a slave, or his descendants were made the slaves of the descendants of his two brothers, Shem and Japheth. And so that particular story of the beginning of the human species actually puts it very early. And Islam, of course, encountered slavery during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, when it had already been universally practiced throughout the world. And as I said before, that the slave may be utilized for domestic service or for industry, as we know, became the common reason for it during the transatlantic slave trade. And one thing we also have to get out of our minds when we talk about this subject is the word Blackness. We have to sort of try to erase that from our thinking, right? First and foremost is that, because this is what makes it most controversial, most sensitive when we talk about slavery in of course, in particular in the Western world, is that that we automatically equate slavery with being what happened to Africans and those the descendants of African slaves in the Americas during the transatlantic slave trade. And there's a certain type of a particular type of brutality that the slave trade and the slavery itself had been characterized by during that particular period, as we know. And then, of course, it was abolished during the 19th century, towards the end of the 19th century, at least for most places on the planet. And even though there were still some places in other parts of the world, including the Muslim world, happened to continue to cling to slavery even late into the 20th century, unfortunately. But we have to sort of try to transcend that and sort of like erase the idea that Blacks were exclusive slaves throughout all of human history, and that only Blacks were enslaved. As a matter of fact, the word slave itself originates from Slav, which is the term utilized to refer to the Slavic peoples of Northern Europe, because for them, they were perhaps the first slaves in Europe, the Slavs. So, Africans enslaved Africans, Europeans enslaved Europeans, Africans enslaved Europeans, Europeans enslaved Africans, Arabs, they enslaved Arabs, and Persians enslaved their own, as also others. So everywhere on the planet, there were individuals who actually owned or legally owned other people, right? In which it itself is the greatest sense of outrage that we experience during our time today. But there are many different reasons why a person fell into bondage or into slave status. Sometimes it had to do with the issue of we call it debt slavery. That you have a person who owed a particular debt to a particular person, but didn't have the ability to pay off the debt. And they would actually surrender themselves to the service of that particular individual until their debt was deemed to be fulfilled and was defrayed through their service to the individual. Sometimes slavery was the result of what we call subsistence, right? Where, in other words, some people were starving to death, and they may actually come to a person and say, well, I don't have any food, and I'll work your crop for you. I'll work your land, till your land for you, and take care of the crops. If you give me a particular subsistence from it, a certain portion of it, so that I can eat and I won't starve to death. That was another way that people fell into slavery. A third way that people fell into slavery sometimes were through kidnap, or and so people were just simply enslaved by others. This happened across the planet. Sometimes there are evil governors in different places where they would sell free people to some of their trades, the people who they're involved with, their trade partners. So there are many different ways that people became slaves, but probably the most common way that people became slaves were through warfare. In other words, two particular tribes, they fight a war, and one tribe loses. As a result of that, the winning tribe had the option to either kill the survivors from the other side, or they could set them free, or they could ransom them. They could demand a ransom for their lives, or they could enslave them. And so this is one thing, and this is the only form that Islam actually endorsed and continued during the time of the Prophet ﷺ and beyond. But all the other forms of slavery, debt slavery, subsistence slavery, of course, slavery through kidnap, et cetera, that all those forms of slavery were outlawed by Islam. And the only one that was allowed by Islam was slavery through captivity as a result of losing a war.
So, you summarized it pretty well, Sheikh. So now that you defined it, and then you've kind of explained different categories and ways, and how out of all of them, only slavery through warfare was kept alive and practiced. Before we go into the hukuk, or the rights, and kind of how slaves were viewed, you said that one of the things that need to be done is that the concept of blackness and the idea is not always associated with it. Would you want to kind of expand on our kind of the average American when we're talking about slavery, the images and pictures that come to our mind, talking about the transatlantic slavery, the plantations, the brutal torture, and kind of the entire imagery of what accompanies our saying of this word? How does that differ from 14 centuries ago, from Medina, or from the early Muslim era? What are some of the key differences there?
Right. Now, this is an important question. You always have to be very careful about how you answer it, because what we don't want to happen is for people to get the impression that we are praising slavery as an ideal sort of situation. Slavery is not an ideal situation. It was never acknowledged by it. That's why it could be utilized as a punishment to begin with. Is that the very fact that the winners of those wars, they decided to enslave their people, that this was a way to subjugate them and to make people feel less human. But at the same time, we can offer comparisons with respect to the realities and with regard to the ideals of both what existed during the Middle Passage, and also what was the case during the time of the Prophet ﷺ and throughout much of Muslim history. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that Muslims always lived up to the ideals, because we have to also highlight those situations where Muslims, they depart from the ideals. But we also have to acknowledge that when they do depart from those ideals, that they are departing from ideals, that Islam actually upholds a very high standard of morality with respect to the treatment of other living creatures, not only human beings. So for instance, that we learn from among the prophetic teachings is that an individual, if a person owns a slave, that the person has to have the financial means to own a slave first and foremost. And on top of that, the owner has the obligation to feed and clothe the slave according to the same standard that he or she feeds and clothes himself or herself, right? And so if you eat, I don't know, biryani and tikka masala every single night, your slave has to eat the same thing. You have to feed them the same thing. It's hamburgers, then you have to give them hamburgers as well. If you wear silk, of course, men are not allowed to wear silk, but say women, if it's a female slave, you also adorn them in silk as well. So in other words, what happens is that when this occurs in a society, let's say we imagine these two people walking on down the street, you find one actually happens to be the owner, and the other happens to be the servant or the slave, that though the onlookers are not able to really see the really true distinction or difference between the two of you, right? In that sense, so right there, the individual who actually is the owned party is not looked upon or feels even less or even more, we say, more dejected and more humiliated by that particular interaction. So the food should be of the same quality, that the clothing should be of the same quality. Abuse was not tolerated, right? When abuse is not tolerated, if a slave, as a matter of fact, the Prophet ﷺ actually made a condition that when a particular slave owner actually was abusive towards his or her slave, that in itself could become the basis for them being set free. Right, and this is also the case with regard to like animals. Like, for instance, if you actually own animals like cats, or you own a cow or camels, then cattle in general, that if you were abusive of them and if you did not take care of them, then the judge can actually order that those animals be stripped, taken away from you because of your neglect of them. So it was a responsibility. So it wasn't only just like, okay, it was a sign of status, but it also with responsibility. Islam made it a responsibility, and when the individual was unable to fulfill that responsibility, then they could actually have their slaves taken from them by court order, right? So abuse wasn't tolerated. Castration was not tolerated, as was the case in the European slave trade, for instance. The slaves had to be provided with a place to live, similar to like, for instance, one has dependents that you have to provide for your dependents. You also have to provide for your slave. So Islam actually gave slave rights, right, in this particular regard, and add on top of that, the right to marriage was also enshrined in the Islamic law as well. The Quran is very explicit; actually encourages marrying off one's slaves. So one that you said one min ibadikum. Subhanallah, the ayah is slipping in my mind. It's my that marry off your unwedded people among you, as well as the righteous among your slaves, male and female. So the Quran actually encourages this, and so a slave is even allowed marital rights during even though they're in servitude.
So would you be comfortable, Sheikh, in putting it this way, that there are differences between the slavery from that era and all forms of slavery are not the same? Right? Is that would you say that's a good way to put it?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there definitely differences, but slavery is not all the same with regard to how the person becomes a slave, how the slave is treated, whether or not the slave has rights, whether or not the slave can actually take one's owner to court to petition for his freedom, a lot of things like that. And this is not like in America, Dred Scott, or in the case of Dred Scott and other things like that, where the Supreme Court says that the individual or slave or a black man has no right to be acknowledged. That none of that existed in Islam, at least according to our rules. And that's not to say that there wasn't the problem like this in the Muslim world in certain cases, and Muslims always lived up to the ideal. No, they did not always live up to those ideals, but we do have to make that distinction. Islam stipulates one thing, and what people do or what Muslims do is something different altogether. And we can't say that Islam is guilty of injustice if the Muslim is not following the rules of Islam.
So, earlier on, Sheikh, during the Prophet's life, what are how would we view riq from that time, in general speaking, and what do you feel are the most important things to be highlighted from like a tashri'i perspective, from a maqasidi perspective? How was riq like at that time in Arabia, and did the Prophet did he transform that, and what were the Shariah's kind of goals and objectives at that time or for later on?
Yeah, of course, the Prophet ﷺ, he came with revolutionary ideas in many different areas of human socialization, right? And of course, one of his revolutionary ideas had to do with the fact that the value that a person was determined by their taqwa. That in itself is revolutionary, because the Arabs themselves, they placed value on people on the basis of who their fathers were and what type of reputation their fathers had. Right, you know, the nasab wal hasab, you know, that in the Prophet ﷺ, he changed that, he revolutionized that first and foremost, and that in itself is an important step in the right direction, or an important step in humanizing any given individual who may have been a slave during the prime time of the Prophet ﷺ. And then when you add on top of that the particular rights and obligations upon the owners of the slaves, you know, towards the slaves, that in itself further humanizes an individual. The Prophet ﷺ, and also the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, that he has multiple injunctions, we know, that encourage or not only encourage, but actually even prescribe setting free a slave as a way to expiate oneself of one's sin for certain type of misdeeds that you commit. The Prophet even promised Jannah for people who actually set free their slaves. So the Prophet ﷺ was very clear about how slavery or bondage was not an ideal condition for anyone to be in. However, he refused to just simply strip away the right or the property rights of his Sahaba and any other person in the same way that Abraham Lincoln had done. And I would say that one of the problems with this, we call the general emancipation, which happened in the States, and this is not to say that we should go back in time and change what it did occur. I believe that Abraham Lincoln should be praised for what he did and for the courage that he showed with regard to setting free the slaves, regardless of whatever reason he did it for. When people will say he did it for political reasons, they didn't really do it because he felt that blacks were equal to whites. It really doesn't matter at the end of the day, because this man, he gave his life for what he believed in, and part of what was fueling the Civil War in the United States was the issue of slavery. So, but we also see, because of what he had done, and that the Prophet ﷺ did not do, was that the African Americans, or the blacks, or the former slaves and their descendants up until of course the 60s and beyond, even beyond the 60s, they had an enormous struggle, many different struggles, with an attempt to try to integrate into a society of people who did not ever want to see equality between themselves and their former slaves. To an extent, you can sort of analogize the situation between whites and blacks post-slavery as a situation where you have a man who really, really loves his wife, but he's very abusive to his wife. And then the judge steps in and decides to divorce his wife from him and say, you know what, she's no longer your wife. Now, how would that man feel? He's still in love with her, and he wants his wife back, and he would do everything that he wants to get his wife back, right? Except we would say that in that case is motivated by love. But with regard to white Americans, the problem is that it's not necessarily about love, but it's about fears. Because what happens now is that you fear that if these people ever get equality, true equality with you, they actually may turn and do to you the same thing that you did to them, right? So fundamentally, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he didn't take that route. He wanted everyone, in my view, he wanted everyone to get a reward for them doing things that were moral acts, right? And of course, the heart itself is the seat of morality. And so the Prophet ﷺ would tell them about the enormous rewards that they would receive if they do things like that, if they set the slave free. As a matter of fact, in his final khutbah, or his khutbah of the Hijrat al-Wada, he actually, one of the groups of people that he actually counseled the Muslims to take care of and be kind to was that of slaves. Or it's one narration, that he's calling them and beckoning them to make sure that they be good in their treatment of the slaves. And he even in one narration, he goes on to say that if you happen to find that some one of them does something that you find to be unforgivable, فلا تعذب فبيعوهم ولا تعذبوهم or فبيعوهم ولا تعذبوا عباد الله. He said, then you should sell them and do not torture or torment the servants of God. And he even referred to them as the servants of God, and not the servants of you, not your slaves, but the slaves of God, right? Even though these individuals had what we would call sort of legal ownership. So the Prophet ﷺ, he revolutionized the society with regard to, again, the focus on piety rather than color, or rather than, we would say, blood ties. It wasn't necessarily a matter of color, but it was about matters of who your father was. He revolutionized in that way. He revolutionized it by placing many strictures on the rules of slavery, conditions on ownership of slavery, and that in itself was a revolution in itself. He limited the avenues through which a person can become a slave, and he also he introduced multiple ways of the slave becoming free, right? For instance, through makataba or tasbir, the different ways that an individual, a slave, can actually become set free. And so in our books of fiqh, we actually don't have a kitab or a book called Kitab al-Riq, or necessarily a book of slavery, but rather we have books about how you become free from slavery, Kitab al-Mukataba or a Tadbir, for instance. You have those type of books, those ways about where you become free. And we know the famous statement of Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh, that that when did you enslave the people after their mothers gave birth to them free? And so the attitude of the Sahaba, many of them believe that this is the default state of the human being is freedom. This is the default state of the human being is freedom. And when they're enslaved because of a justification, because of a reason, because something they did that deserved, that actually made them worthy of bondage. And they justified that. They felt that captivity, as a result of losing a war, becoming a prisoner of war, that in itself was a moral basis for enslaving those individuals. But then, of course, the Prophet also encouraged people to set slaves free if they become believers. That's also another situation as well, you know. So at any rate, there are many different things we can say about this, but there are many ways that the Prophet ﷺ revolutionized Arabian society and revolutionized the ideas about slavery, and also he did not make it a condition that only a certain type of person could be a slave. He didn't say that only black people could be a slave, only Africans could be slaves. No, there were Arabs who were slaves. Many of them, some from the Sahaba who were slaves or former slaves. You know, there were Persian slaves, there were Arab slaves, there were Abyssinian slaves, Yemeni slaves, Syrian slaves. There were Roman slaves. All of these people, you can find them in the Sirah, and it was not restricted to black people, those we refer to as Africans or blacks.
Jazakallah khairan, Sheikh. And I think it's very interesting because in my Al-Adab al-Mufrad class, when we went through the kitab, of the hadith of riq that are there, all of them, and the hadith of Imam al-Bukhari says, "Babu la yaqulu abdi." Right, hadith also saying, not to say abdi, and hadith of, feeding them from what you feed, and babul al-abdu ra'in, and all those. I think if all those hadith are read in continuity together, that paints a better picture for that.
I want to add something here before you ask your next question, and this is an important point that you made here, and that's one thing I wanted to actually highlight as well, which is that again, the Prophet ﷺ did not allow for the owners of the slave to refer to their slaves as my slave, abdi, right? He told them, if you refer to them as anything, call them your mola, your patron or your client. And there's a beautiful story which is told by Abdullah bin Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, radiallahu anhum ajma'in, which is the nephew of Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib. And he talks about how once he was on the outskirts of Medina, and he sees this man who's sitting with the dog. And from a distance, he noticed this man, he's taking a bite of food, and then he'll throw some to the dog. And every time he took a bite, he'll give something to the dog over and over and over. So he finally reaches this man, and he can tell that the man is a slave. And he's actually here, he's overseeing this particular orchard. And so he asks him, he says, whose slave are you? Who's your owner? And so the slave said to him, I'm owned by the descendants of the progeny of Uthman ibn Affan, radiallahu anhu. And so he says to the man, he says, well, I noticed there's something very strange about you, what you were doing. You know, I noticed that you were giving the dog something, and then you eat and give the dog something as well. And so, well, why is it that you do that? And he said to him, I personally feel shy before Allah that I eat something and someone is looking at me while I'm eating. I feel that I have to share something with them. And as a matter of fact, this dog has been with me my entire life. He's my companion, right? So why should I not give him something to eat? So Abdullah bin Ja'far, he really was amazed by this. And so he visits the family without the slave knowing that he had done this. And he goes to the family, and he visits, and he buys the slave's freedom, and he purchases the land that he owns, and he returns to the slave one another day, and he says to him, he says, I want to alert you to something. I've actually purchased your freedom, and I purchased this land for all these orchids here, they belong to you now. And so the man responds to him in amazement. He says, are you joking with me? Or are you really being honest about what you told to me? So the man said, so Abdullah bin Ja'far said to him, says, no, I'm speaking the truth. You are free to go, and you now own all of this land. And so then the man says to him, to Abdullah bin Ja'far, said, then you should bear witness now that I give this land back to the progeny of Uthman as a waqf from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to be under their supervision. So actually he donates the land to them, right? Which is really interesting. It tells you something about his treatment, how the people, this family of Uthman ibn Affan had they treated him, you know, and clearly it had to be based upon the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ, which actually humanized the slave. So this is a slave who actually become a free person and not have any rancor in his heart at the end of the day for the former slave owners, and actually be very charitable towards them as a result of this.
Jazakallah khairan, Sheikh. That's a very, very touching story, and I think that should be shared just on the side. So, Sheikh, the summary of all of this, that what we just discussed, all these ahadith and all this, it really points towards that, number one, Islam does not seek to preserve, or does not seek to expand the institution of slavery or praise it. Rather, it worked with the system, and the Prophet ﷺ used different avenues. You spoke about getting to the bottom of people's their moral senses, the hadith that talk about it, the treatment, all of this together, it points in that direction. So the question, I think, the more tougher question that when this this is put forward, what people ask is that, then why did not become mansukh during the Prophet's time? Why was it not abrogated, and why was it left open for that avenue to be there for Muslims later on, to whether they adhere to the ideals or not? Why even leave that open the way it was done with khamr and intoxicants, that it was gradually prohibited? What are some of the wisdoms why that was not done?
Right. Yeah. Well, again, one wisdom, as I mentioned or alluded to before, perhaps, is the very fact that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he himself was concerned with people acting out of their own volition, right? So what he did was he incentivized them to set free the slaves. The Quran made it a prescription as well. Certain sins committed, set free a slave. You intentionally break your fast, set free a slave. And you have, of course, multiple instances of that. But I'll also say that one of the reasons that we don't find an abrogation probably can be summed up into what I already talked about with respect to Abraham Lincoln. Maybe the Prophet ﷺ, he knew that this is what could occur if the ground had not been prepared for an individual who was once a slave to now be a free person, and the individual who was supposed to be an owner of that person not being prepared as well to understand that particular slave or human being requires a certain type of treatment towards them, right? And so because this was a system which had been around for centuries, for millennia. As a matter of fact, it had been around for millennia, and it was a trade. It was part of the trade. It was and other things as well. So he limited it, and then he discouraged the practice itself, but he didn't remove it as well. And also, I would say another reason that perhaps we say that the Prophet ﷺ did not remove it or abrogate it, or nor did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala abrogate it, even though there are some Muslims who make the claim that it was abrogated, but the khutbatul wada' is the greatest proof that it was not abrogated, and that the Prophet ﷺ talked about being kind to slaves during his khutbatul wada', and that is one of the greatest proofs that it was not abrogated. But of course, I would like to be able to say that it was abrogated, but just we have to be honest that it was not abrogated. But I believe that one of the reasons it was not abrogated is that there was a sound moral basis for slavery, right? And that was losing a war, right? In other words, that you tried to kill me, and I didn't let you kill me, and then I got the best of you. I got the upper hand. Now you have the option. I could choose to kill you, take your life right now, right? Or I could demand payment for your freedom from your people, right? Or I could decide to put you in my service, right? And also, you know what? I want you to be humiliated because, that, and send the message to others as well, that this is what can happen to them, right? So I do think that in itself is a rational and moral basis for justification, right? So Islam, of course, will say, according to Islamic teachings, the default status of the human being is freedom, but that in itself does not necessarily mean that Islam considers slavery to be objectively evil. Islam, there's no basis for that idea, because similar to what we talked about when we mentioned patriarchy, right? If we assume, right, that slavery or just simply the ownership of another person is evil, is objectively evil, and it should have been known by people going way back to the very beginning, and they were just not evolved enough. And we've become evolved enough to understand, right? And we're much better than those people, much more moral than those people, right? So now we're getting it right, and we know now that slavery was bad. But no, we're not better than those people. Right? We are no more moral than those people. We are less moral than those people. We're less rational than those people in many different ways as well, right? And so fundamentally, it was one way as a punishment, which can be utilized for individuals who decide to try to invade and to take over your land, your property, or take your lives. And so there's a valid, rational basis for it, and that is to punish those individuals who are your enemies when they try to bring harm to you and to your people. So fundamentally, that would be the reason why, or reasons, I guess you would say, why I believe that the Prophet ﷺ did not abrogate it, or that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not abrogate it.
Okay, Sheikh. So we have some questions here, and I think we're gonna, because we've discussed the major part of it. Before we take questions, what is your advice for students, for professionals, when they're faced with this question? Right, and like you said, wording is very key here, because quickly you can say something that you'll be cornered with. How would you advise people to handle this when your coworker or your classmate, and they're not going away, you're going every day to that class? How would you advise people to handle that situation when it comes to them questioning this?
Well, I mean, I think the best answer you can give most of the time is that any answer I give to you will not be satisfactory to you, because you're not a believer, right? And that, at the end of the day, that's the best answer I believe you can ever give those people. And because unless you put yourself in the mindset of a believer in the Quran is God's word. It was sent down from the heavens by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through his angels, through the messenger alayhi salatu wasalam, and it is his perfect his scripture. And it is characterized as Hamid Hakim, praiseworthy and wise. And if you don't accept that, and which, of course, by extension, you have to accept the injunctions that are there in the Quran, then there's not really much that you can do to try to convince an individual. I mean, the same person you'll also struggle to convince them that polygyny is halal and that, you know, it's not immoral, you know, an immoral type of relationship. You know, many Muslims, you struggle to even convince them that it's okay for a man to have more than one wife in certain situations based upon the proper conditions, right? That you, among so many other things in the Quran, jihad is part of the Quran. Jihad is there. You remember jihad? You remember that's the only thing that people talked about, you know, is that, you know, Islam allowed for warfare, you know, and yeah, Islam allows for you to defend yourself. And somebody wants to hurt you, Islam allows for you to do what human nature calls you to do, which is to defend yourself. Even if someone punches you in the face, your arm goes up like this. Why? Because your body is reacting, trying to block, you know, the punch, you know, even though you missed it, right? That, you know, it's human nature for you to fight back or try to defend yourself. And so Islam allows you to defend yourself, and then sometimes allows you to take the offensive, you know, if there is good reason to believe that your enemy is about to attack you. So, so there are many different things that we're going to have discussions about, and you have to learn how to detect when the questioner is truly looking for an honest answer and when they're not. Most of the time when people ask you these type of questions, they're just simply trying to start an argument with you because they themselves believe that you're upon falsehood and they're upon truth, and they want you to be convinced and converted to their ideas, but they're not willing to consider your particular paradigm and also the sources of your morality. So as the Quran says, lakum dinukum waliya din, and that's what you have to do. You have to leave it there sometimes.
Lakum dinukum waliya din. Beautiful, Sheikh. So we're going to take some questions here. The first one here is about Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for this lecture and explanation of slavery at the time of the Prophet. Could you explain the rationale behind why a man is allowed to have relations with his slave woman?
Well, again, Islam, you know, of course, I preface this with that because this is probably the most sensitive and the most difficult part of the topic of slavery. And I knew someone was going to ask it, and there's no way that you can't ask it, actually. But it's the most sensitive topic because we have to remember that most of us have been influenced by ideas of liberty, ideas of consent, et cetera, right? You know, so whereas consent becomes like the most important aspect of our lives, you know, having absolute freedom to do what we want is the most important part of our lives. Because the same person who asks this question about, who may not the Shahab, not you in particular, but the same person who's not a Muslim who would ask you such a question would also ask you, well, why is it that a Muslim woman has to obey her husband? They ask you that same question as well. And so most of the time when we get these questions, they're not intended to actually invoke an actual honest answer that the listener is actually trying to process. Rather, it is meant to do tashkik, to sort of extend doubt and shake up our convictions about Islam and about the Quran. But fundamentally, the way I answer this generally is that that there was a different time, right? You know, there was a different time, and this is a universal system that everyone in every single society in the world understood the rules to. They understood that if your woman and your children were captured by your enemy, then that was the possibility that those women could become the concubines of some of the men in those tribes, and their children could become slaves as well, right, on top of it. And so Islam encountered something that was already part of universal human socialization, and Islam sort of placed certain strictures on it, right? The relationship between the husband and the wife is based on consent, but it's not based upon consent in the sense that we understand it according to sort of progressivism, right? In other words, progressives will sort of tell you that if you're married to a woman, then there's a such thing as spousal rape, in the sense that, let's say, for instance, that even though your wife, she submitted to you, but at that moment she was upset and she really didn't want to be intimate with you, that itself could constitute rape because she really didn't want to, and so she only did it because you sort of put some pressure on her, right? Reminded her of certain rights, obligations, and sort of a type of psychological abuse that was committed to her. But in our Sharia, basically, we learned that consent is given at the beginning of the relationship. That this is what happens when a man and a wife, they marry. That it fundamentally is saying that this particular man has a right to intimacy with this woman, right, during their marriage, and this is why he continues to provide her with monetary sustenance throughout the marriage. And if he refuses to do so, then she has no obligation to allow him to be intimate with her, right? And if she refuses to be intimate with him, he has no obligation to continue to provide her with maintenance, right? So, but anyway, the whole point is that the issue of consent happens at the start of the relationship. It's not a situation where every time a husband wants to be intimate with his wife, he has to ask her permission, right? In a sense, like, do you give me permission to touch you here, to do that and do this? No, that's not where it works. But this is what it's become in our own time. And similar to this is that what happened in the case of concubines. Like I said, it's very sensitive. It's not really something that you can easily speak about, but it was understood by not only those who became the captors of these women, but the women themselves. There's no reason for us to believe that the women, for the most part, in large numbers, actually resisted the advances of their captors, right, after it became clear that she was not going back to her former husband or whoever if the situation may have been, in her previous life, right? So that's really the best I can say about it, is just that this was a different order. There's no reason for us to believe today that the Muslims en masse would return to this. Of course, we saw what happened with ISIS, which I guess we say is very unfortunate that it did occur, especially with of course certain groups in Iraq. Unfortunately, and of course a stain on the legacy of Islam. I mean, in the sense that non-Muslims see that as an example of Islam. But of course for us we say no, it wasn't. But fundamentally, this is simply one of those questions which any answer won't necessarily be satisfactory to most people, and many of those people who belong to the most category happen to be Muslims themselves. But if we believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-Hakim, and He is Ahkam al-Hakimin, and He Himself mentioned this in the Quran as one of two valid ways that an individual can be intimate, a man can be intimate, is either illa azwajihim or ma malakat aymanuhum fa innahum ghayru malumin. Allah says that unless it be between those who protect their private parts, unless it be with their wives and with those with whom the right hands possess, then for those they are blameless. فإنهم غير ملومين فمن ابتغى وراء ذلك فأولئك هم العادون. And whoever seeks anything above that or beyond those two, then those are the ones who are transgressing. So it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says it is a lawful way towards intimacy. It's a lawful contact. It's a form of sexual contact. And that's, as a believer, we have to leave it there. But this understanding that the people of the past didn't have our sensibilities, where they didn't have our hypersensibilities about these things. And there's more reason to believe that the woman of the past, they readily surrendered themselves rather than them resisting and actually found themselves in a situation where they were sort of overpowered and being raped. Wallahu ta'ala wa ahkam.
Jazakallah khairan, Sheikh. Here's another question, which is, I guess, asked often. If hypothetically a proper Islamic state or governing body were to exist, would it be impermissible for them to take slaves? And even if the slaves they did take were prisoners of war?
Well, I mean, of course, anything hypothetically, if it could occur, I mean, I mean, we wouldn't call it Islamic State, but, or anything like that, because once you start utilizing those terms, you fundamentally have undermined what the Prophet ﷺ, Medina, for instance, represented. It wasn't what we would call an Islamic State, but at any rate, let's work with it for now. But hypothetically, if Muslims found themselves in a war, who actually Muslim had a leader, a unified leader, that we all agreed upon, and we followed them, and a war started between the Muslim state and the non-Muslim state, then hypothetically, theoretically, even that it would be permissible, according to the Quranic teachings, for the men who take women captives to actually have intercourse with them, but with conditions. The conditions are that those women had to either be Christian or Jewish women, or a Muslim woman, of course, meaning they became Muslim, not before they became captives, but if they became Muslim while being a prisoner of war, a captive, then yeah, the individual, the private owner of that particular individual, who was allowed to take on the ownership of that woman, according to the Islamic teachings, would be allowed to do so, according to that. But again, this is not something that we, it's unlikely, highly unlikely that this would be something that most Muslims would revert back to, although we've already seen that it did happen with some people. But the books of fiqh are very clear that a Muslim can only have intercourse with, even if it's a slave, then it has to be either a Christian, a Jewish, or a Christian or Jewish woman. Let's just sort of just skip the Muslim part altogether, because we don't want to cause any additional confusion there. But a Jewish or Christian woman who we fight with, and if it happens, they become captives. But if the woman's an atheist or a Buddhist or et cetera, a Hindu, there's no basis for permitting the Muslim man to actually have intercourse with them, according to the teachings understood from the Quran.
Jazakallah khairan, Sheikh. I think that's all the questions. Any concluding thoughts, concluding remarks you want to make, kind of a take-home message for our listeners?
Well, yes, I think that thank you. First and foremost, I'd like to thank you, Sheikh Hamzah, for the opportunity to address this topic. It's a very sensitive topic, controversial topic, especially with regard to the last two questions. That these are not things that I take lightly. The misunderstanding is very easy to occur when answers are given to these questions. There's no encouragement for Muslims to value slavery. The default status of the human being is the status of freedom. The only valid way to become a slave Islamically has been that individuals lose a war to Muslims and they can become the captives and the slaves of the Muslims. But Islam places many strictures on the treatment of those slaves if you actually do own them, which are different from those that we've seen in the past. And slaves are not only black people. Anybody can be a slave, and slaves have been in every society. In India, they had slaves. In Egypt, they had slaves. In China, they had slaves. Everybody had slaves. Most of the slaves during the Ottoman period, and in particular during the Tamimid period, were Circassian slaves, like from Russia. So anybody can be a slave according to the basic teachings of the religion, but it's not something desirable, as we know before. But I also would say that it's important, and I do applaud the Masjid in St. Louis. I'm sorry with the entire acronym, what every letter stands for, but you, with your leadership of Sheikh Hamzah Imtiaz, for having these type of discussions, because I believe that one of the main reasons that young Muslims, they're placed into crisis is because too many of our teachers in the past have avoided these type of topics. And so what happens is that we go to university, and you never come across any mention of polygyny or of the hitting verse or of slavery or of jihad and of all the other things, or the hudud. You never heard anything about these things. Then all of a sudden, some non-Muslim person who doesn't like Muslims, doesn't like Islam, comes to you and they introduce these things to you, that the individual ends up leaving Islam. leaving religion, leaving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, turning their hearts away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we don't want that to happen to anyone, nor to anyone's child. So it's important for us to actually speak, have programs or have teachings about these very controversial issues, encourage all the Muslims to read the Quran on a regular basis. And so when they do come across these things, and that gives them impetus to actually come to a learned person, to actually have a conversation about them and help us to work through these things. And I would say, lastly, if you ever read something in the Quran or anything about the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ that you find to be uneasy, it makes you feel uneasy, don't think that itself is a sign of weak faith. You know, that in itself is something, is natural. That Islam is, it means submission. And submission is not easy. You are to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? You know, that you don't understand something, you should come seek understanding of it. And then hopefully it'll solidify your faith and make life easier for you and grant you and give you pride in your religion and knowing the truth about things. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He not allow our hearts to swerve away from guidance and to keep our feet firm upon the path of truth, inshallah. Barakallahu feekum.
Jazakumullah khairan, Sheikh. We're honored that you took time out for us. And hopefully, inshallah, once things get a bit better, we can have you here in person in St. Louis. On behalf of our youth organization, the Muslim Youth of St. Louis, and on behalf of the parent organization, our masjid, our foundation, the Islamic Foundation of Greater St. Louis, I'd like to thank you and appreciate all the work that you do, and ask that you keep us all in your du'as.
Inshallah, you do the same. Barakallahu feekum.
Jazakumullah khairan.
Okay, you take care. Yes. Assalamu alaikum.